Had a professor, John Hale, out of Tulsa.
Yeah.
So I looked you up, I was like, he remembers her name.
There's not really a lot of Hales.
He's now the president of the Tandy Computer School of Computer Science.
Nice. Not related, unfortunately.
He's not that old.
Yeah. Good. Okay, guys, we'll go ahead and get started. Title of this talk is the current state of memory forensics. My name is Jason Hale. I'm a digital forensic examiner with One Source Discovery. I primarily deal in digital forensics as it relates to civil and criminal litigation. I also deal with incident response at the company. So I'm also an adjunct instructor at U of L. I teach the computer forensics class there. I also teach the information security course occasionally. As far as formal education is concerned, I went through my master's of digital forensics at Central Florida and went through the U of L CIS InfoSec track here locally, various certs in digital forensics if you're interested. So I'm going to kind of speed through this first portion since we're running a little bit short on time. I want to try to keep it in the time frame here. So today we're going to just start off quickly looking at the basics of memory forensics. Basically, we're really just talking about why this is important and why we're interested in it. We're then going to get into memory acquisition, memory analysis, and we'll round out today with a discussion on a couple of Windows 10 architectural changes and fundamental changes that have an impact on memory forensics. So memory forensics is important, and perhaps maybe this is for obvious reasons, but this gives us insight into recent system activities. So these are things like running processes, network connections, open files, things that are happening on the system at the time the memory is captured. Oftentimes this is data unavailable anywhere else. So this could be data like encryption keys. There's been research out there to show extracting TrueCrypt encryption keys from a memory dump, as well as anything else that may reside in the memory that may not be cached or flushed to disk at some point. So we'll look at that. One of the big things here, decrypted malware. Excuse me. Decrypted malware is one thing that is critically important in malware or in memory forensic investigations, because oftentimes we find that malware, when it's sitting on disk, it is packed or encrypted or obfuscated in some way that doesn't allow our reverse engineers to come in and parse this and pull it apart without first going through some auxiliary phase of decrypting the malware or unpacking it. So we're able to pull this directly from memory. That makes that process a lot easier. We're also seeing that memory is not, or malware is not always saved to the disk. So there are instances of memory-only malware where there's not going to be an executable on disk associated with that malware. So memory forensics is obviously important in those scenarios. Just from a big picture standpoint here, memory forensics allows us to better understand an event through correlation. So in and of itself, it may not tell the full story, but if we combine that with disk forensics, if we combine it with network forensics, we can help really tell a better picture of what happened during a particular incident. So the most common approach here is going to be to dump physical memory from a target system and then to analyze that using some type of memory analysis tool. So there's a few out there. And the good news in this space, a lot of the top ones are free and open source. So this is not something where you have to invest thousands of dollars. This is something that you can go out and download from GitHub today and start messing around with this. Live analysis is possible, so if you really wanted to try to analyze a system using memory forensic tools as it's running live, you could do that. It's generally not the best approach because unless you know exactly what you're looking for, you're going to be poking and prodding and running scans and doing various things to your memory dump. So when you're running on a live system, you have all of these things changing in the background. And those things, if you capture the memory dump as it is when you're there, you don't have to worry about things within your memory dump changing. So typically, the process is to capture and then analyze that. Has anyone gone through the process of analyzing memory before? And go based on. Okay, so a few. Okay, so we'll start off quickly with the memory acquisition. For those of you who attended this conference last year and came to my talk, my entire talk was about memory acquisition. So we're really just going to spend a couple minutes on it today to talk about how it works. If you're interested in the acquisition phase specifically, definitely go out to YouTube. I think it's on YouTube. And check out my talk from last year. There's plenty of resources out there. I'm not going to spend as much time on it today, but I do want to cover it a little bit. So in general, memory acquisition is simply copying volatile memory to a storage medium. So this could be a desktop, could be a laptop, it could be a phone, anything that has volatile memory. This would be copying it off to somewhere else for storage so that we can later analyze it using some tool. There are various options in this space. I like to kind of categorize it into three broad categories: as hardware, software, and this other hybrid category that has some alternatives. So the hardware category would be using something like a PCI card or FireWire to dump memory using direct memory access. I talked about this quite a bit more last year. I'm not going to really get into it. That is an option. Software, in my experience, is by far the most common approach for acquiring memory. This is running some type of tool on the system that you're trying to dump memory from and running it on the live system and dumping memory that way. And then you have this other category that consists of these alternative approaches that you may want to use if these other two aren't available, or depending on the situation in conjunction with them. So you have things like VMware, virtual machine suspension, snapshotting, basically going through the hypervisor of a virtual environment to dump or capture the memory associated with the virtual machine. So VMware has this option, VirtualBox, Hypervisor, Hyper-V, they all have this option that you can do this with. Crash dumps are very interesting in this space, so depending on the settings on your system, obtaining a crash dump from a system just from the actual disk could provide significant insight into the memory of that system. Now typically this is not going to be a full memory dump, it depends on how it's configured, but this could be useful. Hibernation files fall into that same category, so this is a lot of times if you only have the disk, if you don't actually have the live system to work with, and you're just looking at say a forensic image or just a copy of the disk, you may be able to pull off a crash dump or hibernation file and analyze that as if it were a memory dump. Finally, the cold boot attack. Has anyone heard of the cold boot attack? There's been some research on there, and there's some combating research on the practicality of it, but essentially it is cooling down RAM modules from an actual system, transplanting them over to a different system, and reading them from that other system. It's possible. There's been in 2013 there was some research saying that DDR3, that's kind of where it stopped. So because of the scrambling mechanism of DDR3 RAM, cold boot really wasn't practical. Now, actually earlier this year, there's been some other research that came out and said, well, actually that is possible. If you've got a small number of bytes, you can decrypt it. So at any rate, that's an option. Not really going to cover that either any more than I just did. Today we're really going to focus on the software portion because it is the most common. So this is going to be acquiring memory by running software on the target system. Typically, the process works by connecting a flash drive, an external hard drive, or something like that to the system, running the acquisition tool from that USB device, and then saving the memory out to maybe a network share or to that same USB device. There are many options available in this space as far as tools are concerned. I have a list here in a couple slides that we'll look at, but there's a lot of options, but not all of them are equal in that they don't all operate in the same manner. And this becomes important, particularly when you start to consider the the possibilities introduced by kernel-level malware. I talked more about that last year, but the point here is that with memory acquisition software, there's really two different approaches that most tools tend to take. One is to map a kernel object. Typically, it's the physical memory object. The second would be to use some type of kernel function to actually map the memory and dump it that way. So those are the two most common. You can see what they both have in common here is they're interacting with the kernel. They are dealing with kernel objects, they're dealing with kernel functions, which means that our acquisition tools, when you run them, you'll see that they load a kernel driver. They have some kernel component to them. That's because they're interacting with things like this. There is an exception to these two options here. So one tool I know of actually directly manipulates page table entries, specifically to avoid interacting with kernel APIs and kernel functions, so that in the off chance you have a rootkit that is hooked to some of those functions, it blocks that. So in other words, if you've got a rootkit that is checking for memory acquisition tools or anything that is requesting the pages associated with that malware, it could say, well, actually, no, I don't want you to read this in. I'm going to return this junk to you instead, or I'm going to return zeros or whatever the case is. So if you go around those kernel functions, you can avoid some of those possibilities with kernel rootkits. So if you were to actually look at the address space, physical address space of a Windows system, this might be something you would see if you were to kind of graph it out. The thing to point out here is that you've got these sections in blue that are RAM, and this is what's going to be mapped, and this is what your acquisition tools typically look at. So when they're dealing with these kernel functions and these kernel objects, they're only looking at these blue sections. These red sections, interleaved here, are going to contain memory that is reserved for various reasons. It may be device memory, it may be mapped directly to registers on a device. And what we found is that reading from these often causes system instability. So from just a pure stability standpoint of the system you're trying to acquire memory from, it's good for our tools to avoid this, because what we don't want is to run an acquisition tool and it crashes your system. So we'll look at examples of that here in just a little bit. But the idea here is that we want our tools to behave themselves to some degree, because we're running in the kernel here. On a user system, it may not be as big of a deal if we crash it, other than the fact that we're losing the memory that we went there to get. But if you're on a production system and you're trying to dump memory from a production system and blue screens, that could be a much bigger deal. So here are some just various forensic acquisition tools, or memory acquisition tools. This is not an exhaustive list. There are a few here on the left for free and open source, a few commercial tools listed there. So if everyone isn't on here, I'm sorry. This is just some that you can go out and download and take a look at if you're interested. Most of them work very similarly. The GUIs will have a start button or a capture memory button. The command lines will have a typical one-liner, something easy to use, with the idea being that we don't want this person that's running this to require a deep level of expertise in order to run this. We want our first responders, we want someone that happens to be sitting, IT sitting a few desks down from this, to be able to go over, run this software, and preserve memory as soon as possible. And the key here is to obtain as reliable of a memory dump as we can as quickly as possible. Because that's really what's going to aid us in the analysis portion. So let's talk about a little bit about the analysis. Depending on your case, you're going to have different goals. But just from a 10,000-foot level, your goals of memory analysis are going to be to extract this data from this memory dump in order to answer the questions that I'm trying to answer. To answer, what websites was this person viewing? If they were looking at if they were using private browsing, maybe encryption keys, whatever you're after, that's what you're trying to extract from the memory. Specific to malware, we're often interested in whether or not the system is compromised to begin with. So we may be seeing alerts from this system. We may be seeing that there's some suspicious activity going on, but we don't know whether or not the system is actually compromised, or these are false positives, or this is just some misconfigured setting that we need to correct. So we want to identify if the system is compromised to begin with, and if so, what are the indicators of that compromise that we can then run across our enterprise or our network to identify other systems that may be compromised with the same malware. So some of the techniques available, we'll specifically look at 3 of these. There are a ton of different techniques. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the common ones are things like enumerating active and terminated processes, looking at the objects associated with those processes. So what DLLs have they loaded? What handles do they have open? How are these processes behaving on the system? Looking at network connections is another one that is oftentimes the first or the second thing that people do when they're analyzing memory. Finally, identifying and extracting files stored in memory. This is important in that regardless of the type of case you're looking at, whether it's malware, whether it's acceptable use policy, or you're just trying to figure out what is going on in the system, it's very common that you will want to try to extract files that may be cached in the memory of the system. So we'll look at doing that. And finally, identifying evidence of injected code. This is another, particularly in malware investigations, this is another key technique that's used. So we'll dig into 3 of these here. Enumerating processes is one of the first, if not the first thing that malware analysts specifically often do. So here we are trying to identify the odd man or the odd woman out based on known normal conditions and behavior. And this known normal is a recurring theme that you will find in digital forensics and incident response and the security industry in general. And this is where baseline really becomes incredibly useful. So if you have if your organization is baselining memory, that's awesome. That is so useful for consultants or for your examiners coming in and trying to figure out what is going on in the system. If you've got a baseline or a gold image of how you know the system is supposed to look from a memory standpoint, it makes this process much, much easier. But assuming you don't, because that's pretty uncommon, at least in my experience, Melissa Torres,
I'm sorry. Yeah. Is there a Dave Woodsey? Dave? No. Okay. Sorry.
No problem. So Melissa Torres, she's a SANS instructor, teaches the memory forensics class at SANS. She gave a great talk a couple years ago about baselining memory. And one of the things that she mentioned was that even if you don't have an actual technical baseline that you create for this purpose, you can still leverage things like the crash dumps that we talked about, hibernation files, things that may exist on the disk, utilizing volume shadow copies in conjunction with those in order to try to figure out what did this system look like prior to compromise. And that's what we're after here, is to try to figure out what is sticking out in this process listing. But assuming you don't have a baseline, some of the things that we're interested in here are, what is the parent process? Was this process started by the correct parent? So there are some core Windows processes. So you have LSAS, SMSS, various processes that you're almost always going to find across any Windows system. And they're going to have the same parent. They're going to have a lot of traits that will be the same across all versions of Windows, or all systems on that version of Windows. We're looking at things like, is this process running from the wrong directory? If you have LSAS running from the app data directory, you've probably got a problem. It should now be running from there. We're looking for things like abnormal command line arguments, suspiciously misspelled names. Service host is a major culprit here. You can see here, it should typically be SVC host. Here it's SCV host. So if you're just scanning down, looking at all the processes, this may not stand out. And that's the point, is that we're hiding in plain sight here. And sometimes we can actually use abnormal start times as an indicator. So does this process start way off of the time that it should start? Should it start at boot time, but it's actually starting a couple of minutes or hours later? So here we've got a process listing, a PS list plugin from, this tool is Recall, one of the major memory analysis tools. And this is just a list of processes running on a system that is infected. You can see that there's a couple of processes that have exited here. But scanning down here, I understand it's probably hard to read, particularly towards the back. Is there anything that stands out? feel free to just yell it out. But if you're not used to looking at this, if this is something that you don't do commonly, it's not easy to pick out what is going on here, particularly just by the names here. So we don't know where these are running from. We don't have a lot of the other information associated with these processes that would be helpful in determining whether or not they're actually even suspicious. But what we do have, we have 3 LSAS processes running. Does anyone know how many LSAS processes should be running on a typical system? So we should generally have 1. So the fact that there are 3 here is a red flag to us. Just on the numbers alone, we know that there's something goofy about the fact that there are 3. So if we dig into these a little bit further, say, let's take a look at their parent process. Let's see who started LSAS. Now on this one, the top one, we can see that WinLogon started LSAS. And in some cases that may be normal, in some cases it may not be, depending on the operating system. So Vista and beyond, WinINet, we would expect to start LSAS. However, prior to that, we would expect WinLogon. So depending on the version of operating system, this may be normal. So if we look at the parent process of these other 2, we see that the PID 668, which is services. Now services should not be starting LSAS. So if we see, just looking at this, just looking at the parent process, these bottom 2 LSAS processes are really starting to stick out as being potential problems here. And we dig in further, and we look at the start time of these. You can see that the first one, whose parent is WinLogon, starts at 10:29, which is around the same time a lot of the other processes that start at boot time start. So by all appearances, this one started when the computer started. But if we look at these other 2, these actually start several months later. So now these are looking seriously suspicious, and these are ones that we would want to dig into further to see what DLLs and what other process objects these may be interacting with, and even dumping these directly out from memory and analyzing those further. So network artifacts is a good one in that if you're looking at that process listing and there's nothing that's standing out, there's nothing suspicious there in and of itself, or you just want to start with network artifacts because because the process listing isn't going to do much for you, this can be very beneficial. So here you're looking for simply suspicious connections. You're looking for whether or not this system should be communicating with that system, or this process should be communicating over that port, and so on and so forth. So if we look at, this is the output of a ConScan plugin. This is from Recall as well. So same tool here, different malware infection. I meant to ask, did anyone recognize the previous malware based on the 3 LSAS processes? So that was actually Stuxnet. And that's when you can go out there and download. It's awesome to take a look at. It's free on, I think it's the Art of Memory Forensics website is what it's hosted it. Not 100%, but I know there's samples out there. So this one, different malware, but what we're looking for here are network connections. And specifically, if we look at this remote address column here, aside from the 1.0.0, the 2 instances there, which are almost certainly false positives because of the ridiculous PID. If you ignore those 2, these others, if we take a look at those, do any of these stand out? These remote IPs. There are 2 that are not like the others, and this ending portion is just the port that it's connecting on. So this 58.64.132.141, these IPs stand out in that they just don't look like the others. We don't know what they are right now, but we know that there's something different about them. So if we take a look at the PIDs, we want to see what process is this associated with. We can also see that it's connected on port 80. So maybe this is a browser. So if we take a look at it, we can see that this is service host. So now we're asking ourselves, should service host be communicating over port 80? Probably not. Maybe it depends on what exactly that SBC host is doing, but that's something that we're interested in. So if we take that a step further, we say, well, what is this IP address? Well, this resolves to Hong Kong. So now we have a service host communicating over port 80 with Hong Kong. Now, is that normal? Probably not. So you want to go ahead, take a look at this SVC host. We could go back to our process listing. We could go back to the handles and the DLLs associated with this SVC host to figure out what in the world it's doing and why it's communicating with Hong Kong over port 80. Extracting files from memory is another key portion here in that regardless of the type of investigation you're doing, this can be critically important because very often we're interested in files that are simply cached in memory. So think of things like event logs, Word documents, even open pictures that the user is looking at or was looking at. So when we go to do this, we're essentially scanning the memory for file objects and noting either they're offset into the memory dump or we're dumping them based on a regular expression. So maybe we want to dump all files that end in EBTX to get event logs, or all files that end in TXT or something like that. So there are various use cases here, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go over it, because even if you don't deal a lot in malware investigations, this can be important. So the way this process would work, if you wanted to go through it, would be we would first go through and identify the, say we're interested in text files. So we go through, we identify the text files in the memory. So we've switched now, we were in recall, now I'm switching over to volatility. This is kind of one of the other big memory analysis tools. Has anyone used volatility? Those of you who have done, yeah. So this is one of the big ones that most people that deal with memory analysis, they use this one or recall. There are other options as well. At any rate, so we're running a file scan plugin here, and we're looking at everything that ends in .txt. Now we could say we want to dump everything that ends in txt, but in this case, I just want to dump this first on-access scan log. That's the only one I'm really interested in. So I would note the physical offset here, and then use the dump files plugin from volatility, specify the physical offset that I noted here, and it would dump it out to wherever I've specified. You could then cat this to make sure that it looks like it's intact. It looks like it is, at least the first 5 lines of it are. So that's really all there is to extracting files. What is important to keep in mind is that there is no guarantee that this entire file is going to be cached in memory. So we may have half of it, or we may have a good portion of it, but if some of the pages associated with this file were paged out to the disk while we were acquiring that memory, then we're going to be missing those pages. So depending on how your acquisition tool handles that, those may be zero padded or something like that. But the key here is that you may not be able to obtain an entire file from a memory dump. You may just be able to get 80%, 50%, 20% of it. So it really depends, but this is an incredibly useful technique when it comes to the analysis portion. So I'm really just I haven't even hit the tip of the iceberg on memory analysis. Yes?
Is there a way to trace back, if you run into those missing pages, trace back through cache?
So if the question was, is there a way to, if you've got portions of a file that were paged out, is there a way to basically go back and figure out that they were paged out and find those on disk? And unless you did that during the acquisition portion, it would be incredibly difficult. So really what you would need to do is, as you are acquiring memory, your tool would need to see that, okay, this file is actually paged out to disk, but let me pull this in and put this in the dump. Now, I'm not aware of any tools at this point that actually marry them up like that. At one point, there was one that claimed to do it a while back, but I don't think that's still around. So the short answer is it would be really difficult to do that. Your best bet is to capture the entire page file at the time of acquisition and try to marry them up, but it would be difficult. So memory analysis it's an incredibly expansive topic. It continuously changes. With each operating system, there are some significant changes that occur. So we saw in Windows 8 the encryption of a data structure known as the kernel debugging data block. And unfortunately, this KDBG was something that a lot of our analysis tools relied on to find other key components in our memory dump. So when this thing was encrypted, that broke some of our analysis tools. We could no longer do a simple process listing, or we couldn't walk the structure to list out these processes. And many other portions of that no longer work because this key structure we were relying on is now encrypted. So there are going to be changes like that that occur that we have to take into account and that our tool developers have to take into account during the analysis. A lot of times this is going to involve reverse engineering these structures. This is not easy work. This is looking at an in-memory data structure using the kernel debugger, trying to figure out how these things are working so that we can piece this back together from a memory dump alone. One of the things that you'll find when you get in, if you start to get into memory forensics, is that knowledge of operating system internals is really, really helpful here. So understanding executive objects and understanding just how a process is compiled and how it works and how it looks in memory can really be beneficial in just understanding the output of your tools, understanding what they're telling you and what they're not telling you. Going back to the changes here, we've seen that there are some significant changes in Windows 10. Obviously from a user standpoint there are some, but from a architectural standpoint and just fundamentally there are some changes here that impact memory forensics and plenty of other fields as well. Specifically today, I want to get into memory compression, and I want to talk about virtual secure mode. There are tons of other things that I could talk about, or that could be talked about here. So the Windows subsystem for Linux is an interesting one that's starting to become more popular. I think there was a Black Hat presentation this year. If I'm not mistaken, there's actually a DerbyCon later on. There's a presentation on WSL as well, at least based on the name. It sounds like it's WSL. But you also see changes in process names and hierarchy. And the reason that kind of stuff is important is if you're trying to figure out, if you're trying to find things that are hiding in plain sight, well, the fact that the task manager has a different process name on Windows 7 and Windows 8 and Windows 10, that becomes important. And the parent process of various things becomes important because it's going to vary based on your operating system. But again, the two things I want to focus on today are the top two. All right. So Windows 10 memory compression, this attempts to improve system performance by simply reducing the number of writes to the page file. So what this is trying to do is to limit how many times we're having to fault and go out to the disk, the hard drive, or even an SSD, whatever the case is. It's trying to avoid all of those instances where that happens. And instead, it's saying, hey, if this memory is not being used, if this page is not being used, let me compress that, move it over to a different store in memory instead of writing it out to the page file. So this all goes back to performance. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. Now, this is only used when it's needed. So if you've got a ton of RAM in your system, you may not see this kick into effect. But if you are using a tablet, or if you're using a smaller laptop with not a lot of RAM, then you can start to see memory compression improving your system performance. And what you would generally see is it's going to be a little bit snappier. You're not having those reads from the disk. We also see that Metro apps are tightly integrated with the memory compression model. So whenever these things are suspended, which I don't know if you guys have seen, whenever a Metro app is not in the foreground, it enters the suspended state. And then when it's in the suspended state, it's actually compressed and it goes to its own memory pool until it's resumed. So if you were to look at Task Manager, you might see something like this. So if you're running Windows 10, I would expect a few of these to be listed there. In this case, we can see we have the Search and Cortana Assistant is in the suspended state. What that's telling us is that this memory is compressed until we bring this Search UI back to the foreground, right, and it's resumed. So we also see that depending on what version of Windows 10 you're running, you may actually see memory compression mentioned in the Task Manager. Now this varies. I've seen, so initially I believe when Windows 10 first rolled out, it was just the system process listed here, which was causing problems because as you can see, this process is consuming 150 megs of RAM. So you'll see forum posts and things online about, hey, why is my system process using 200 megabytes of RAM all of a sudden? Well, the reason Windows wasn't telling you necessarily if it was just a system process listed, but the reason is because all of these non-Metro apps, when their memory pages are compressed, they're moved over to the pool that the system owns, that the system process owns. So you would see that reflected here. So the point is, depending on what version of Windows you're running, you may or may not see compressed memory mentioned in your task manager. If you don't, it's still there. It just may not be listed. So the reason this is important for forensics, specifically memory forensics, is that in terms of just the amount of content available in our dump, when we acquire a memory dump, when memory compression is in use, the value of that memory dump will increase because inherently we have fewer pages paged out to disk. In fact, we've seen that on average, Windows will page out 50% less or half as much to disk whenever memory compression is being used. So what that means is now these pages that we were talking about that could have been paged out to the page file and we're trying to extract those files, now those are still stored in memory, they just may be in a compressed state. So the value of our physical memory dump in terms of just pure content that's going to be in there increases with memory compression. On the flip side, our page file decreases because it's going to have less data and the data that is in the page file will be compressed. So the problem here is that our memory analysis tools, to my knowledge, have not caught up with this. So if we dump memory, we'll have this compressed memory in here. But our analysis tools aren't to the point that they can identify this compressed memory and decompress it from a memory dump. So we'll still essentially be missing those in terms of analysis, but they'll be there in our acquisition. So until our memory analysis tools catch up and are able to deal with this compressed memory in the dump, we're kind of at a loss as to how to leverage this added value. But it is there, it's just that we can't really reap the benefits just yet. So Windows 10 Virtual Secure Mode or VSM. Has anyone heard this technology or is anyone familiar with it? See a couple ads, maybe nine. So this provides the underlying architecture for things like Credential Guard and for Device Guard. So you've probably heard of Credential Guard and Device Guard and other things that this makes possible. But essentially what VSM does is it utilizes a hypervisor and it essentially splits things into a normal world and a secure world. And it assigns virtual trust levels, or VTLs, to each of those worlds, where VTL 0 is the normal world, VTL 1 is the secure world, and VTL 1 is more trusted than VTL 0. So it's similar to our ring model, but it's not in the same. You still have ring 3 and ring 0 in each of the worlds. And I've got a graphic here in a minute that should help explain this. What's interesting here is that secure world is isolated from normal world using second level address translation or second level page tables or SLAT. So basically, the hypervisor is controlling access from normal world to secure mode through SLAT. So it's basically making sure that we don't have unrestricted access to whatever is running in secure mode. So in order to really understand this, it is helpful to just quickly go through the traditional architecture of what we're used to seeing and what we've been dealing with, and what most systems are still running. So you've got typically user mode sitting on top of kernel mode, sitting on top of the hardware. Most applications are going to run in user mode. If they need to make a privileged call, they'll reach down to kernel mode. It will do whatever it needs to do and return the output to user mode. So that seems like a good model, right? It works. Kernel mode handles the more privileged operations. We still have a less privileged user mode. So what's wrong with this? What could potentially go haywire here? The issue is we can't trust the kernel. So we know that it's more than just a possibility that we could have malicious code running in the kernel of our system. So Windows tries to solve this problem with Windows 10. So what it does is it takes the kernel mode and splits it from the hardware, and it pushes a hypervisor in between that. And then puts a secure user mode and secure kernel mode up beside it and essentially isolates the two here with a little got a wall here, but basically this wall is implemented through second level page tables. So what this does is it's saying, hey, everything running over here in user mode and kernel mode, you don't have unrestricted access to anything running in secure user mode and secure kernel mode. So essentially, communication between these two is highly proxied and sanctioned by Microsoft. You can only communicate in Microsoft sanctioned ways. So when you're running things like Credential Guard and Device Guard, those run over here in secure user mode. Those processes are called trustlets. These trustlets are limited in what they can do. They're isolated from one another. They're very purpose-built. So Credential Guard, for example, tries to, specifically it's designed to prevent pass-the-hash attacks, or those types of attacks where you are leveraging the fact that traditionally your LSAS process in kernel mode was trying to protect your NTLM hash and your Kerberos ticket. It takes those secrets out of your LSAS process, moves them over to a new process in secure mode called LSA ISO. And it says that, okay, now you can't communicate, you can't access the memory space of this LSA ISO process from normal mode. So there are various protections in place to prevent unauthorized apps from running in secure mode. And this kind of begs the obvious question of, okay, so we've got all of these restrictions set up, we've got all this model set up, so can you have malware running in secure mode? And the short answer here is that it would be incredibly difficult if you have all of your platform security features in place. So if you've got secure boot enabled, if you have an IOMMU, which essentially tries to block DMA attacks, if you have a TPM, if you've got all of this VSM configured properly, if everything's working like it should, then no, it's going to be extremely difficult to do this without some type of hypervisor or firmware exploit to get around this. So even if you were to get into that and you're able to run something in secure mode, these trustlets inherently cannot do file and registry I/O, so they're extremely limited in what they can do. So if you've got malicious code, it's hard to be that malicious if you can't do file and registry I/O. Alex Unescu did a great talk last year at Black Hat, and he really got into the details and the internals of trustlets and secure kernel mode. So if this is interesting to you, I definitely advise you, take a look at it. That is on YouTube, I believe, as well. So let's wrap up with how this affects memory forensics. Now, from the analysis side, this doesn't do a whole lot other than it creates new processes. So when you have Credential Guard and you have the secure kernel enabled, you'll see the creation of these two new processes, LSA ISO and secure system. So it changes what normal looks like on a system. Well, what's interesting is while we can see that these processes are running, we can't actually interact with their address space. Whereas all of these others, your service host, your LSAS, everything else running in normal mode, you can interact with as long as you have a kernel code. So, for example, if we try to take a look at LSAS here, this is using Process Hacker. You can see there's no problem dumping the memory, from LSAS. But if we were trying to do the same thing with LSA ISO, we get an error, unable to read memory, invalid access to memory location. So what this is doing is it's saying, hey, you're a process running with a virtual trust level of 0, but you're trying to access a memory page that has a virtual trust level of 1. So it blocks that access. And this becomes a serious problem when we're trying to acquire memory. Because what happens is that our current memory acquisition tools will run in normal mode. So they know that these pages exist in the secure world. We still handle memory management in normal mode. But the problem is we can't dump most of the memory associated with that. And the way that this presents itself is in the form of a blue screen. So, in fact, with every single tool, memory acquisition tool that I've tested, software memory acquisition tool, except for one, I encountered this blue screen. So what happens is it loads the driver, and the system promptly blue screens. And the idea here is that we're trying to access pages we don't have access to. So what we can do here, if you encounter a system with VSM where you're trying to figure out what is the way around this, the short answer is we'll go below the hypervisor or use something else to dump the memory. But if you're on a physical system, that's not as easy. If you're on a virtual system, you can still use things like snapshotting and things that we talked about earlier to dump the memory. But you can't be on a live system at this point currently and expect to be able to dump memory pages from secure mode. So just to kind of recap here with with changes in Windows 10, memory compression really just complicates the analysis portion. It doesn't affect the acquisition. In fact, it increases the value of our memory dump. VSM is where we encounter real problems with our memory acquisition. So again, most of our software tools at this point will crash the system when you try to run those. It will change, VSM does change what normal looks like on a system, so we do have that change in the analysis, but that's really about it from the analysis standpoint. So basically keep up with the technology, know your tools, know their limits, keep up with Twitter, the normal spiel here. So there's a lot of online resources here. There are memory dumps available if you want to go out and actually download those from websites. So I encourage you to do so if you're interested in this stuff. Here's my information. I know we're just at time, so I don't want to hold you guys up anymore. If you have questions, feel free to, I'll stay here, but ask me questions now. There's my email. I don't know why I put my Twitter handle on there. I'm on Twitter technically, but I don't tweet a lot. So if you're interested, there it is. But thank you guys.